Hello. Did you know that the most terrifying being in Middle-earth's history was once a spirit that loved order and saw perfection? Yes, today we will be talking about the story of Sauron, whom we all know as the Dark Lord. Sauron was not evil in the beginning. His first name was Myron, and this name meant admirable, excellent. Let's go back to the beginning of the universe. Before the world even existed, there was only Eru Iluvatar, the supreme creator in Tolkien's mythology. And from his thoughts, Iluvatar created the Aenir, holy spiritual beings of immense power. Some of these beings would later become the Vala, and others, lesser but still incredibly powerful spirits, became known as the Maiar. Sauron was one of them, but not an ordinary one. Myron was exceptionally gifted in craftsmanship, order, precision, and knowledge. He hated chaos. He wanted everything to function perfectly, efficiently, flawlessly. And because of that, he first served all. All was the great Vala of smithing, creation, metalwork, and the shaping of the physical world. Myron became one of his greatest disciples. And this is extremely important, because the reason Sauron would later become capable of forging the Rings of Power is because he learned from all himself. He mastered fire, metal, craftsmanship, structure, control. But this is where the first crack in his character began to appear. Myron loved order, but he did not love freedom. To him, disorder came from independent wills. The more freely people acted, the more chaotic the world became. And this is exactly what drew him toward Melkor. Melkor, the first Dark Lord, later to be known as Morgoth. Melkor was the most powerful of the Aenir. Indeed, it was said that it contained fragments of the powers of all the other Vala. But its problem was not merely greed. They wanted control. They wanted to create. They wanted to dominate. Even as the music of the universe was being composed, it sought to add its own melody against Iluvatar's design. And Myron, this is where he began to be influenced. Because unlike the other Vala and Maiar, Melkor could do whatever he wanted. But of course, this meant the following. Everyone submitting to a single will. At first, Myron perhaps truly believed that the world would become more orderly. But over time, as he remained in Melkor's presence, he began to change. He was no longer called Myron, because the awe-inspiring spirit had gone. New name, Sauron. So, the one who is despised, the one who is hated. When the First Age began, Sauron was now one of Melkor's most loyal servants. Melkor gave the rule of Angband to Sauron. Melkor is ruling from his fortress called Utumno. Shurin has become Melkor's right-hand man. If we look at Sauron's abilities, one of his abilities stands out. Shape-shifting. Sauron could assume any form he wished. A wolf, a snake. They could even assume forms resembling vampire-like creatures. Now, let's move on to one of the most incredible duels in Tolkien history. The story of Búrin and Lúthien. Lúthien was one of the most powerful elves in history. Búrin, on the other hand, was a mortal human, and these two set out to steal the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. But their path first led to Sauron's fortress, Tolin Gorhoth. That is the Isle of Weirwolves. And here, Sauron and Lúthien confronted each other. Sauron transformed into his wolf form. She used dark spells, but Lúthien's power was incredible. And finally, Sauron was defeated. He was forced to abandon his fortress. This event is very significant because it is one of the rare moments in the Tolkien universe where Sauron is directly defeated. Then the end of the First Age came. The Vala finally began the Great War against Morgoth. The War of Wrath. This war was so great that continents were torn apart. Beleriand was submerged. Mountains collapsed. And Morgoth was finally defeated. He was banished to the void. So what did Sauron do? Here's a very interesting detail. According to some sources, Sauron briefly regretted his actions. He appeared before Eowyn, the representative of the Vala, and wished to beg for forgiveness. But he did not fully submit, because there was still arrogance within him. He feared being punished, and he ran away. Sauron waited 1,000 years, and he decided to become the new owner of the Dark Throne left vacant during Morgoth's absence. In the Second Age, Sauron was now alone, but this did not make him weaker. He had made his plans. Sauron wanted to rule the races of Middle-earth under an iron fist. And for this, he would use another weapon as important as war: deception. During this period, Sauron took on a very beautiful form. He gave himself the name Anatar. That is, the one who gives gifts. He did not appear before the elves as a terrible Dark Lord. Wise, kind, he seemed like a helpful person. It particularly affected the elf blacksmiths of a region. And here, Celebrimbor steps in, an extraordinary craftsman, descendant of Fëanor. Sauron won his trust. He taught them how to make the Rings of Power. And thus, the Rings of Power were created. The 3 elven rings, the 7 dwarven rings, the 9 human rings. But all this was a trap, because secretly in Mordor, another ring was being forged in the fires of Aradruin, the Mountain of Doom, the One Ring. And into it, he placed a great part of his own soul. But the elves realized they had been deceived. The moment Sauron put on the One Ring, they sensed his mind, and they took off their rings. Thereupon, the war began. Eregion was destroyed, Celebrimbor was killed, and Sauron's true face was revealed. But still, he could not achieve complete victory, because there was Númenor. Númenor, the greatest kingdom of men. The Númenorians were so powerful that even Sauron at one point realized he could not fight them. And here again, he used his intelligence. He surrendered. Yes, you didn't hear wrong. Sauron surrendered knowingly. He was taken to Númenor in chains. But this was exactly what he wanted, because he quickly became the king's advisor, then the priest, then the manipulator. Then there was the true master of the island. He used people's fears. He used their desire for immortality. And at last, he persuaded them to go to war against the Valar. Worse still, he established a cult of worship for Melkor. Human sacrifices began. Temples were built. Dark spells spread. And so the greatest fleet in history was assembled. The golden ships of Númenor sailed west toward Valinor. Men now believed they could invade the lands of the Valar and seize immortality by force. But at that moment, Eru Ilúvatar intervened directly. The world changed. The sea parted, the heavens darkened, and Númenor was destroyed under a mighty wave. The once most glorious civilization was wiped from history in a matter of minutes. Ar-Pharazôn and his army were imprisoned forever on the shores of Aman. But the most interesting detail was Sauron, for during the fall of Númenor, his physical body was also destroyed. However, being a Maya, his spirit was not completely annihilated. He returned to Middle-earth like a dark shadow. But something had changed. Sauron could never again assume his former glory. That noble image, once perfect enough to deceive people, was gone forever. From then on, he remained only a dark being, spreading fear and hatred. His spirit returned to Mordor, and they regained their strength. Then the War of the Last Alliance began. Elves and men united. Helgalath, Elendil, and great armies marched to Mordor. Barad-dûr was besieged. At the end of the years-long war, Sauron himself came to battle. He killed both Gil-galad and Elendil. But in the end, Isildur, with the broken sword Narsil, his father Elendil's sword, he snatched the One Ring from Sauron's grasp. And right here, Sauron was defeated, because his connection to the ring was severed. His body collapsed, his soul dispersed, but it did not completely vanish, because the ring still existed. Here begins the Third Age. For centuries, Sauron hid in the shadows. He gradually gathered strength. At first, no one realized he had returned. He appeared in Dol Guldur under the name Necromancer. But Gandalf realized the truth. And finally, Sauron returned to Mordor. Barad-dûr rose again. The Nazgûl returned. The Orcs have gathered. And Sauron's only purpose remains: to reclaim the One Ring. Because without the ring, it was incomplete. But if the ring returns, it would become almost invincible. Here begins the main story of the Lord of the Rings. What Frodo carried was not just a magical ring. It was a part of Sauron's soul. That's why the ring corrupted everyone. Boromir, Gollum, it even frightened powerful beings like Gandalf and Galadriel. Because the essence of the ring was Sauron. And finally, Mount Doom. Frodo failed in his attempt to destroy the ring. In fact, one of Tolkien's most important messages is hidden here. No one can completely resist absolute power, but Gollum's obsession and his own greed caused the accident. The ring fell into the lava, and when the One Ring was destroyed, Sauron also fell, because the source to which he had devoted most of his soul had vanished. Barad-dûr was destroyed, his armies dispersed, the Nazgul have vanished, and Sauron, perhaps he did not truly die, but it turned into a shadow so weak and without willpower that it could never take shape again. We're coming to the end of our video. Thank you for listening.